So my presentation, as Karen read, is about the contribution of the Windrush generation on British Baptist worship. And this is from the perspective of embodied worship. And I will have to disagree just a little bit, or probably a lot, with what Yuan said about Winward he would not have been happy for someone to be doing worship as from an ontological perspective. So in his Whitley Lectures of 1963, Winward spoke about embodied worship that goes beyond the intellect of worship, and that it has to do with what is written about the biblical worship in spirit and in truth, which takes on the person as Jesus presented in the flesh. The Word was embodied in the flesh, and the Word dwelt among us. So in similar fashion, the embodiment of worship took on the person of Reverend Clement Sam Reed. And he was from the Windrush generation that came to the UK here between 1948 and 1973. And so Sam Reed, he pastored at the Moorside Baptist Church in Manchester between the period of 1962 and 1965. And he was the first Jamaican of his era to really serve as a British pastor. And from that platform, he made notable contributions to British Baptist worship life. And that was through how he ministered, how he led the church at Moorside, how he participated in racial unity at that time, and how he really improved and allowed the congregation to grow, because at Moorside, it was a small congregation when he went there, but after he left, it had grown to a sizable number. I can't give you the statistics, but that's what I read. And so Sam, as a person, he was born in Dumfries, a community in the northwestern parish of St. James, Jamaica, in 1936. And he was schooled at a primary school there, at Unity Primary School. And as a teenager, he was 17 years old when he was called to enter college, Calabar College at the time, for ministerial training and formation. And Calabar College at the time in Jamaica was the only Baptist college that was training Afro-Jamaicans for the pastoral ministry. So that's where Sam entered. And during his formative years, he was schooled in the British formal liturgical way of worship, because his tutor there was the Reverend Jellyman, who was a BMS worker at the time in Jamaica. And when Sam was at Calabar in Jamaica, he excelled in his studies, and Reverend Jellyman noted that he would benefit in receiving additional studies. Hence, he was one of the first Jamaicans, as Reverend Dr. Richards in the back there highlighted in one of her papers, that he was the first person within his generation to have studied here at Regent's Park College. And after Sam finished his studies here, he was recommended to Moorside Baptist Church, and then he was later ordained in 1962 on the 3rd of March. And his ordination service was quite an ecumenical service, where it wasn't just Baptists who were there, but the Pioneer magazine that was written every month since Sam was there, it highlighted the fact that several people from other denominations came to celebrate with Sam as he was ordained at Moorside. It was recorded that the Reverend Matthew Bryan, an Anglican rector at St. James's Mosque at the time, he was present at Sam's ordination. And the ordination, as was quite similar to how Sam did his ministry, it reflected the inward and the outward aspect of worship that we've been talking about, that was quite present and what was spoken about by Windward. So at his ordination, there was, bowing, there was kneeling, because Sam had to kneel so that hands were laid on him. It wasn't during my time when I stood and hands were laid on me, but Sam, he knelt in the presence of what he said was God, and the hands of his minister there, his superintendent, the area leader, who was the Norman B. Jones, he laid his hand on Sam at the time. And a part of the service also involved the congregation standing. So they weren't just, sitting and looking at what was happening, but they were participating. They were bodily doing something. They rose to their feet. They stood. And that was a part of their act of worship to God as they embraced Sam as their new pastor at Mosside. And whilst Sam was at Mosside, the New Baptist hymnal that was co-authored by Windward was in circulation at the time, because it was done in 1962. So that would have also formed how Sam completed his acts of worship, because they would be singing hymns. I have actually in my collection, the 1962 hymn book. I'm sure some of you do have that hymn book, the beloved green hymn book. When I was in Jamaica, because I was born in Jamaica and I attended Baptist church in Jamaica, and that was the hymnal that we used there. And even today, when I visit my parents, they still use that hymn book in the church. So you can see that Windward legacy lives on even in Jamaica if it's not being done here. So that hymn book was present during the time that Sam was at Mosside in Manchester. And from my readings, I realized that Sam's worship style wasn't just from British Baptist kind of style. He used his Jamaicanized style of worship because he was a Jamaican, so he was influenced by just being Jamaican. So you might say that how Sam presented in the type of part of the type of worship he offered was that it might have been quite charismatic, if you might say that, because from one of the presentations I read, it talked about the Jamaicanized type of worship that involved clapping, that involved use of the body, so that embodied worship, where the body was used to dance, to sway, to stamp the feet, to raise the hands, all part of the embodied part of worship where the body was being present. It wasn't just the intellect, it wasn't just the mind, but the body was used. So even when Sam was expounding in his pulpit, he just didn't use words, but he encouraged his people to use a theology of service as their worship. So he would encourage them to help the poor in the neighborhood. He himself participated in those acts of service, where one of the ladies, Beryl, she said that Sam would be seen carrying a bag of coal to an old lady's house, helping her during time when it was quite cold, the time of winter. And I believe in 1962, the winter in Manchester was quite cold. They must have had, inches of snow, not like what we see today. But Sam encouraged his congregants to participate in acts of service as their worship unto God. Also, a part of 19th century Britain was the time where a large number of the who were known as the Windrush generation came from the Caribbean. And during that period, there were concerns around the challenges between the races in Manchester at the time. But Sam was quite a unifier. He practiced the theology of peace. So in terms of the inward worship that Windrush talks about, Sam actually lived it because he worked with the different races, people who were racialized as black, racialized as white, racialized as Indian or Asian. He worked with them to have them unified in his congregation so that they could do the work of the Lord, as he said. Sam was quite a man when it came to evangelism, because as I said, it was a small congregation when he started at mosque side, but when he left, the congregation grew. It is documented by Robert Hayden that over, I think it was 200 weddings that Sam did, even in 1 year. So that showed how many people came to Sam and how much his influence was in the community around him, where he reached out to not just his congregants, but those in the community to show God's love to them in a time where there was racial division at play. And continuing to talk about Sam as the man, Sam was involved in politics. So he didn't see a demarcation between theology and politics. He saw his role as God's representative, not just for the church, but for the community. And he was involved in politics. When he left his role at Moss Side and he returned to Jamaica, he became a Senate in both political parties at the time. There was the Jamaica Labour Party and there was the People's National Party. And he served them as a senator because he saw the need of the people. It wasn't just, Sam the selfish person. Sam was a giving person. He understood the heart of helping the poor, of helping people. That was his theology of worship, doing acts of service. So he saw the needs of the poor. We spoke about earlier around having a collection at the Eucharist. For him, it was real because around him were many people who had several needs. And he didn't just sit behind his pulpit, but he got out into the community to help those who were in need. And that touched the hearts of not just his congregants, obviously, but those in the community, and that drew them to encounter Sam's God, the God who cared about their needs. So we see that Sam, he cared about the state that the people were in, and even from a political office, he used it to speak speak about the needs of the people and to help reach the needs of the people. And then the people in turn, they came to God because they saw the love of God through Sam, who was an embodied person of how he saw worship. He saw worship that it had to involve being and doing. So the inward man, the inward biblical beliefs that he had, the theology that he expounded was about knowing God, but doing, not just talking about God, theologizing about God, but actually doing something to help those who are in need. So Sam's tenure in Manchester was only for 3 years. And at the end of that period, he returned to Jamaica. I spoke to Carl Johnson of the Jamaica Baptist Union just to have more of an understanding of Sam's life when he returned to Jamaica. And he told me that Sam didn't just, sit idly when he returned, because he returned as still a young man. He wasn't yet 30 years old. Mm-hmm. So he was full of vigor, he was full of life. And he did amazingly well when he returned to Jamaica. He participated in several things concerning church life. He incorporated intergenerational worship where he pastored in Jamaica. So at one point, the Sunday school was separate from the main service, and he realized that to help nurture children in an understanding of God's love, they had to be in the main service. They couldn't just be in a separate room teaching and being taught and learning about God. In some of our experiences of church, it happens nowadays, and that's fine. But for Sam, he recognized the need of the young people, of the children, being a part of the general worship setting where they could be taught alongside their parents, alongside the adults, about what it means to serve God, to love God, and to worship God. In Jamaica, as part of the Jamaica Baptist Union, Sam became its president in 1971 to 74, and not just for one term. He gained another term because they obviously loved his leadership. So the second term was in 1983 to 1985. And at that time, he was only in his early 30s. He was only 34. And I smile because I work with young people in my current role at Lindsay Park Baptist Church. And we talk about the missing generation from church, which is sometimes goes from 18 to 34, 35, or even 36. Some scholars, they say it goes up to 40. But here was Sam at 34. He was leading the Jamaica Baptist Union. So it just reminds me that when we work with young people, when I work with young people, I have to see their gifts, the potential that God has entrusted or He's instilled in them, He's poured into them. And my role is to nurture their giftings as a part of worship, their worship, how they will embody worship unto God. Sam also he wrote a book that was called Sam Sharp, From Slave to National Hero, and that was published under the sponsorship of the Bustamante Institute for Public Affairs. So Sam was also a writer because he recognized the need to put pen to paper, to speak not just with words, obviously, but speak with the pen, because he wanted to influence a generation. And when I was doing my research, and I went to Manchester, the Pioneer magazine that was used at Moss Side at the time, every year between 1962 to 1965, every month there was a publication. And on the second page of that publication, Sam wrote a message, "Dear friends," as he wrote to the church. So for him, it was key that a magazine was produced, not just to talk about his ministry, but to include the voices, key voices within his congregation. So for Sam, he relished the fact that writing was important, and he stewarded that act quite well, because he showed his congregants, and even when he was in Jamaica, he showed them that they ought to write, because he was an example of a person who was writing and publishing material. But it didn't really stop there for Sam, because over the years he was a regular columnist of the Gleaner, the Daily Gleaner, one of the newspapers that's in Jamaica. And in addition to being a writer in the Daily Gleaner, he also was a part of, he also had a talk show where he hosted the Hotline, a radio show on Radio Jamaica. And there he spoke about the issues that would face the people, especially the poor people in Jamaica. And over the years, the Gleaner collated all the columns that Sam wrote. So they collated everything, and they presented Sam his collection after he had retired from writing for the Daily Gleaner. And I tried to, get a copy of the collation of what he wrote, but I wasn't able to, get a copy of that piece. It would have been lovely to see and to read how he wrote and what he wrote, the topics that he wrote on. But I'm sure there were important topics because he loved the people and he wanted to give them a voice. He wanted the issues that were important to them to be written about and to be spoken about. But one day, hopefully, I'll get to see what he wrote. So Sam's public life didn't just, he wasn't just, a man behind the pulpit, as I've said. He was a man in the community. He wanted people to know more about his God, that his God wasn't just a God confined to the church, but a God who cared for the people in the public arena. So even in the commercial sphere, he served on the board of directors of one of the local companies in Jamaica, the Grace Kennedy Foundation. And as the years went by, Sam sadly was confined he was retired in 2003, but sadly he had, I think he developed dementia, and he passed away on April 18, 2015. And this was at the age of 78. So many people in the Jamaica Baptist Union, and even from Moss side, they remembered Sam as a man who spoke on their behalf. He highlighted the concerns that they had, and he asked others. He championed the rights, I think, of the poor, because he recognized that they needed a voice. They needed someone to speak on their behalf. And he allowed himself to be in that role, speaking on behalf of the poor. So when I think of Windward and the inward and the outward aspect of worship, and that worship is to be embodied, I believe that there is room for all of us to embody worship and to do practical things in how we look at our theology of worship. I recently spoke about, in Lindsay Park, I recently spoke about my understanding of service, my theology of service, and I saw it as worship. That theology of service has to be, or it has to include worship, because everything we do, yes, it's worship to God, but we have to get up and do something. We have to allow our inward understanding or our inward experience of God to influence how we do our theology, how we put practical aspects to our theology. So I am, if you want to say, a practical theologian, yes, because like Sam, there's someone who has to speak on behalf of the poor. And I encourage us to do so. I know that we're bringing different aspects of Windward's understanding of worship. But for me, I think the embodied part of worship is quite key and quite important in how I understand my role and how I encourage my congregants to do and to see themselves as God's hands in the world, helping those who are in need. Thank you.